Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sarvesh, and I welcome you all to today's JNU Academic event. JNU Academic is an entirely student-driven forum open for all. The foundational principle of the forum is to enrich and enliven possibilities of democratic and civil discourse inside the campus on issues that are of social relevance. JNU Academic has hosted an impressive line of academicians, philosophers, and legal experts in the past. We would also like to request our audience to monthly contribute using the QR code that is in circulation so we can organize exciting sessions such as this one in the future. The title for today's session is The Politics of Bare Life, Practice for the Exception. The background of our poster, as you can see, is taken from the cover of Agamben's book, Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. The photo is a map of Auschwitz Camp in Hitler's Germany, where people were shoved into camps where they are left to die or put to death. Visibly, with the advent of capitalism, there is an increasing stress on efficiency and wanting to use humans for labor. Besides that, the governmentality of the modern times seem to be producing lives by their inclusion into the broader welfare net. But how do these larger developments explain the state's tactics to discard population in camps? It is here that Agamben becomes significant to understand. To elaborate on this more, we have two fantastic speakers with us today. Our speaker for today's session is Dr. Rajarshi Dasgupta. Dr. Rajarshi Dasgupta teaches at the Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. His teaching and research interests include political philosophy, philosophy of Marxism, biopolitics, refugee histories, urbanization, and development. The discussant for this session is Dr. Mohinder Singh. Dr. Mohinder Singh is an assistant professor at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, School of International Studies, JNU. His areas of interest include political thought and theory of India, West, and the Global South, as well as history of political concepts in modern India. The format that will be following is Dr. Dasgupta will get 30 to 40 minutes to put forward his thoughts. This will be followed by Dr. Mohinder Singh discussing Dr. Dasgupta's presentation for about 20 minutes. And after that, Dr. Dasgupta will get a chance to reply to Dr. Singh's comments and questions. This would be followed by a question and answer session from the audience. Thank you to both of you for generously agreeing to speak on our own. May I now request Dr. Dasgupta to come here and begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these generous words of introduction. Let me admit at the very outset that the expectation that what I'm going to present is going to get over in 40 minutes could be a bit of an overestimation. It may very well stretch beyond close to an hour or so. So be mentally prepared for that. And you can take your call right now if you don't feel like sitting around for an hour or so for the presentation. Let me start without further ado. Let me also tell you that though the title of the presentation is more conceptually oriented, laying out a hint of the argument that I'm going to present, this is really a kind of case study of a refugee settlement, a fairly large refugee settlement, and also of urban poor in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. Okay. And it's a settlement that has been compared to, by other scholars even, compared to something that denotes bare life and a state of exception, going by Agamben's framework. So let me start without further ado since we have limited time in our hands. According to recent reports, South Asia is home to over 2.5 million refugees. There is a breakdown country-wise, which I'm not going into. The World Bank estimated South Asia to be home to, by 2021, which is last year, 2,709,820 refugees. That's just the World Bank's estimate for the last year. The UNHCR signed a recent memorandum of understanding with the government of Bangladesh because the refugee numbers in Bangladesh is very high, lower than Pakistan, but definitely high. That outline protection principles in respect of, most recently, 19,000 Rohingya refugees who were relocated to Bhashanchar Island to alleviate overcrowding. But besides the Rohingya refugees, this is what the paper is about. There is a Urdu-speaking Bihari Muslim refugee population. Okay. which is estimated to be around 1,60,000, just by conservative official governmental estimate. In reality, it may be far more than that, of which roughly 90,000 or near about a lakh live in Dhaka, live in temporary shelters in Dhaka. Now, while the existing literature on refugees address the issue of Chakmas and Rohingyas in the subcontinent, you find this literature coming up more and more recently. I think sufficient attention has not yet been paid to this Urdu-speaking Bihari refugees in Bangladesh, apart from a few notable exceptions. This population remains relatively marginal and understudied in the given literature. The paper, what I'm going to do here is to narrate the case study of one large settlement of such Bihari refugees in Dhaka, which presents what can be described as a state of exception, as it has been talked about in some existing literature, drawing upon the work of Agamben as the introduction clarified. And we know that Agamben qualifies the existence in such a state of exception, of course, drawing upon concentration camp, but with the potential of generalization among refugees at large, as bare life, where bare life means a life that is stripped of all power, all kind of politics, uh, of the life's own, um, and which exists in a state of exception. So bare life or Homo Sacer is Homo Sacer, whichever way you pronounce it, is basically the idea of a life that can be taken away with impunity, that is supposed to be expendable. It's one of the kind of juridical formulations that Agamben digs up. Agamben is also a kind of scholar of jurisprudence, old Greek Roman jurisprudence as well as modern. So we try to show, what I'm trying to do here is to show you that despite the signs of living a bare life that exists in a state of exception, the camp population manages to carve out a politics for themselves. Now, instead of talking about this politics practiced by the refugees as resistance, which is the most common kind of framing, or as acts of citizenship, which is how a leading scholar has done it, we will train our focus in this paper on a certain key aspect, which is the act of camouflaging as a refugee practice. Okay, so keep this in mind. I'm flagging this. Camouflage is the kind of refugee practice that I'm talking about. As we shall see, it not only involves changing identities and names, but also personal biographies, life histories, and sense of collective past. It implies, ironically, an exercise of the self that must rearrange the elements which provide it with any sense of stability. This article will try to illustrate this with a general account of life in Geneva camp, compared to Mirpur, that's an adjacent region housing more camps, and other camps, outlining the occupation and the social condition of the people living in this camp. This will be preceded by a spatial history of the area, Mohammadpur, okay, which we are going to look at in terms of how a space has evolved. The locality which houses Geneva camp, and which will highlight the material markers of the camp as an isolated space, a space of exception that is stuck in the middle of a growing capital city, Dhaka. The account of camp life will then be followed, and this is the meat of the paper, a deep dive into the history of two households belonging to one extended family spanning over 3 generations. The advantage of this thick study of one extended family, which is located across 2 camps, is that then we are able to locate a range of different subjectivities at play, and how what I am talking about as practice of camouflage operates in actual everyday existence, as part of a larger narrative with longer timeline and complex ramifications. The conclusion will restate the central arguments and their theoretical implications, especially for Agamben's framing and thinking about refugee politics and subjectivity. The empirical descriptions that follow below are the result of 3 rounds of archival and ethnographic research, which were conducted in Mohammadpur, Dhaka, which spanned over a decade. So I worked from between 2007 to 2017. Um, and the first round of fieldwork was done in 2007, the second could only happen in 2012, and the third round happened between 2016-2017. Altogether, we had structured and unstructured conversations and informal discussions with around 60 respondents. Among them, 40 interviews and 10 group discussions were conducted among the inhabitants of the Geneva camp, belonging to more than 10 households. And now there are several details about the research methodology, which I'm skipping for the moment. If you want, we can come back to unpacking this more during the question answer session. We found the Geneva camp unique to a certain degree with regard to the intensity of its cultural, social, and economic marginalization. But we must remember there are other camps of the same population scattered across Bangladesh that share a similar stigma. At the same time, there are other scholarships to suggest that the practice we are identifying in the camp as camouflaging is, in other words, evident in other camps of Bangladesh too, and possibly in other international contexts as well. Only that they have not been framed as such in the terms that I am framing. With regard to their practice, therefore, I believe the people of Geneva camp disclose some strategic acts that can be generalized for marginalized population and migrants in many other cases. That is broadly speaking the theoretical implication of our central observation in this study, which we are approaching from the intersection of refugee histories, urban studies, and the framework of bioeconomics. Now let me go over to the history of Mohammadpur. And so please let me know 15 minutes before my time is running. The key site of our study is a refugee camp known as Geneva Camp. It was set up by Red Cross and hence the name. It is located in Mohammadpur. Any account of the camp and its population cannot be separated from the larger history of transformation of this area and post-colonial Dhaka's development. Mohammadpur was a sparsely populated area located on the western borders of Dhaka during the Mughal period, and Dhaka is a Mughal period city, as you might know. The city did not change much during the colonial or the British period, okay, when urban changes focused more on Kolkata and later on Delhi. Several accounts liken Dhaka to a provincial town that lacked major facilities right after the partition of India. In fact, it was under the West Pakistani military regime that modern settlements, residential areas, commercial hubs began to come up in Dhaka. Mohammadpur was for long surrounded by large water bodies, marshes and water bodies, which were prone to flooding and which were mostly inhabited by Hindu low caste Namashudra fishermen who also grew paddy when the water subsided, so because it was seasonal flooding. Located on the outskirts, this is where the Pakistani regime decided to create a new habitation for the mostly underclass Urdu-speaking refugees who were arriving after the partition, and largely from Bihar. Scholars like Joya Chatterjee, Ranavir Samardar, Bafia Ghosh, more recently Annesha Sengupta, and a host of others have written at length about how cities like Kolkata and Dhaka were completely overwhelmed with the arrival of refugees and the subsequent policies, measures, and struggles involved in their rehabilitation. Such accounts do not exist for the case of Dhaka. Now, the transformation of Mohammadpur as an area began with cheap housing, refugee camps, and colonies constructed in Mirpur and Mohammadpur in the immediate aftermath of partition. Now, the distribution and allocation of these rehabilitation spaces were not random. They reflected administrative designs based on linguistic preference, cultural ordering, and class distribution. Dominated by leaders of West Pakistan, the new regime that was ruling East Pakistan obviously favored these Urdu-speaking refugees over Bangla speakers. There were four different categories of refugees to be sorted out. The first were the employees or optees who were at the top of the order. Then came the educated middle class whose cultural capital could fill up the vacuum left by the migration of educated Hindus. The Muslim peasants or working classes from bordering areas of West Bengal, Assam, Tripura, and Bihar were fourth in this order. Now, compared to the Bangla-speaking Muslims, this segment, the Urdu-speaking segment, prospered immediately after the partition for understandable reasons. They got jobs with good wages in jute mills, garment mills, and were also allegedly recruited as agents of the West Pakistanis. This is the category that settled down in the close-knit neighborhoods of Mohammadpur and Mirpur and formed the dominant local population until the 1970s. This area underwent another transformation in the following decade. After a major flood in 1988, the Committee for Flood Control and Drainage of Greater Dhaka suggested new landfills and building a new concrete embankment in the area. This led to mushrooming of a host of new housing projects and middle-class residential clusters, like the PC Culture Housing Society, Muhammadiyah Housing Society, Baitul Aman Housing Society, so on and so forth. By 2000, Mohammadpur was no longer a flood-prone periphery of Dhaka, but a densely built-up space with major arterial highways, roads and overbridges, and even condominiums beginning to come up. By 2005, the once quaint Mohammadpur, people used to go there for having picnics. People used to travel on boats from Dhaka. The quaint Mohammadpur had become the bustling address of a large and different kind of population, including students, lower and middle class families, young urban professionals, and many who were migrating from their districts and towns to try their luck in Dhaka. These newcomers had no organic connection with the area, but found it cheaper than living in more upmarket locations, which were high-end localities of the capital. Mohammadpur was not too far from Dhaka's commercial hubs and close to new administrative centers. According to the 91 census, Mohammadpur had a population of 3,16,203 with an average literacy of 56.2% against a national average of 32.4%. So a highly educated demographic, okay, mostly middle class. The 2011 census showed the population increasing to 3,55,843. So a big jump in population. However, the unofficial figures estimated by local inhabitants are much higher than what the census records say. When the big Japan Garden City mega housing project, it's a really mega housing project of the variety that we see now in India, neared its completion around 2010, respondents living in the area told me that the older population of inhabitants who started living in the first set of houses they built in the 1960s were more or less gone from the area. They have been completely removed. Particularly the Urdu-speaking Bihari Muslim refugees who built up the area, populated and worked in the local political economy, were nearly erased from the locality after the formation of Bangladesh. A large number of them who had business network and social capital managed to migrate to Pakistan with their family. Some of these sections settled down in Singh and subsequently joined the Muhajir Qawmi movement, but many of those who supported the Pakistani regime and were even part of the Razakar army, which also operated in Hyderabad, were arrested. A significant number died in the war, and there were alleged massacres that followed immediately because they had supported the Pakistani regime. Those left behind became practically stateless, known as stranded Pakistanis. This is the technical term for it. Disowned by Bangladesh as well as by Pakistan. As Victoria Radcliffe, who's another scholar who's worked extensively on Bihari camps, said the Urdu speakers were not only deprived of their citizenship of Bangladesh, but they were granted citizenship nowhere else. And there was no refugee rehabilitation for which they qualified. So they started living in a legal limbo. The Bangladesh Abandoned Property Order of 72, passed to deal with enemy property, legalized the taking over of the properties of Biharis in this area. As noted before, the surviving population is estimated to be around 1,06,000, of which around a lakh live in temporary shelters in town. The biggest of these shelters is the Geneva camp in Mohammed, located right next to a locality called Adabar, housing 25,000 mostly very, very poor Ansari Karigars of Banarasi saris. Okay. Um, Legally known as stranded Pakistanis, socially they're simply known as Biharis in the Bangladeshi speak. In 2003 and 2008, the Dhaka High Court approved citizenship and voting rights for about 1,50,000 of this population, who were minors in 1971 or born in the country after the war. But despite the court's ruling marking a serious legal victory, this population practically remains stateless. The socio-economic rights continue to be denied for most of them, and they remain outside the ambit of citizenship in effective terms. It is a fact that compared to the period of formal statelessness, the aftermath of these High Court rulings in 2008 has witnessed a visible increase in the social mobility of this population. However, it has not resulted in a significant transformation of their social status as a whole. The larger body of host society continue to regard the Biharis in an inferior, stigmatized, and exclusionary manner. I found very little change in public perception across the Bangladeshi middle class when I conducted my fieldwork nearly 10 years after the court ruling. In terms of mobility, Redcliffe was surprised to find evidences of frequent transnational travel based on forged documents and passports common among this population who had resources. Okay? We'll come back to this later on, keep this in mind. But what actually can make matters different is a perceptible increase in the opportunities of moving out of the camp, living elsewhere in the city. And this, although it happened to some extent in the camps of Mirpur, the number was negligible in the Geneva camp. Let me now give you a sense of life in Geneva camp in general before I go into the family history. Okay? So this section, the discussion is organized in terms of the labor performed by most of the camp population, their kinship network, their access to other spaces, and the dimension of what can be called paralegality in their everyday practice. The next section, this section outlines the next section will outline the disposition of the state and the nature of paralegal practice in response by inhabitants. But before we get down to them, let me admit some limitations of my research, some data. To begin with, in terms of gender and the care economy of the refugee households, and multiple other nuances that I could glimpse but I could not go into for practical reasons of research. Most of the interviews and the group discussions I had male respondents, so that is obviously a bias. And interestingly, the population tagged as Biharis or called Biharis included many different people from several different parts of India, especially UP and the Bengal province. They were still talked about as Biharis. So it was less of a regional sign and more of a linguistic marker. Urdu and Hindi. Those who spoke Urdu and Hindi were seen as Biharis. Many households, like the one we are going to describe in the last section, are results of intermarriages between Muslims who met at various district headquarter towns and settlements at important railway junctions. Quite a few are in fact married to Bengalis from Bangladesh. Many have come from professional and commercial background that enjoy the high degree of mobility across the subcontinent, and they were familiar with multiple languages, speaking multiple languages and dialects. The camp inhabitants are Sunni, but they celebrate Shia festivals with great fanfare. There is a strong presence of religious activities and resources that I'm not going to go into, and a different trope of cosmopolitanism that is centered around a different geography with Middle East at the center of their geography. However, these nuances I had to leave behind for lack of scope. Traditionally, it seems that most of the Urdu-speaking Bihari population were weavers, karigars. Many of them are still engaged in what is called karchupi work, okay, that involves setting glitters and sequins and weaving zari on saris. Okay. In fact, as my interviews with the elderly people like Rafiq and youths like Kamrul and Beloa revealed, they consider themselves as highly skilled handloom workers. They had enjoyed relatively much better income and even prospered until the 20th century, when wearing Benarasi saris was very popular among the elite classes of South Asia. Okay. But as this fashion shifted to chiffon saris from the 90s onwards, majorly, the demand for Benarasi rapidly declined, leaving them with the rather poorly paid Kacheti work to do. Most of the 20 odd households I interviewed in Geneva camp had handlooms that were dug into the floor of their living space. Okay? This is where women, teenage children, and unemployed youths would be working throughout the day. We saw more than 10 small units where the entire household was converted into temporary workshops during the daytime, with rows of looms and around 50 persons working together in these small rooms of this size, let us say, okay, that were scattered across the camp. The workers confirmed that such work hardly managed to cover their subsistence. It is not unusual for the youths of the camp, therefore, to try and supplement this income with casual labor, working as mechanics, putting up small eateries, kela lagana, grocery stalls, so on and so forth, in and around the camp. A large section of people is visibly unemployed. Their sense of frustration affects the general mood in the camp. A small fraction of the camp youth has been lately getting employed as shop assistants in the service sector and gig economy, so delivery boys and so on. Although the court rulings have made them more articulate about their claims, there is a pessimism that borders sometimes on resignation among these growing numbers. Their only hope seems to lie in somehow escaping the camp. That's the only thing that they hope about. But not all households struggle with poverty with the same intensity and precarity. A section of the camp population were relatively well-off businessmen, especially during the Pakistan regime, and they somehow retained most of their contacts and connections. They are able to run some kind of a trade in manufactured petty goods and make up the relatively prosperous segment of the camp. The role of contacts and networks appeared very critical for camp dwellers, which they tirelessly tried to cultivate and extend. What struck me frequently in the conversations are the role of the widespread kinship and relative network, and the capacity of these ties to offset the material disadvantages. So here was a dimension of social capital that would be far from so widespread and active, perhaps among the middle class. My interactions revealed how such networks provided a limited but critical number of goods when one is barred access to capital and institutions, which range from credit without interest to vital information about alternative livelihoods. It's mainly these networks of kinship and contacts that open up seasonal migration opportunities across the subcontinent and even beyond into the Middle East. This is mainly how the more resourceful members of the camp people create access to spaces outside them. These spaces are distributed over a wide geography that the camp dwellers sometimes access. And this will come out more strongly in the last section, which will reveal familial connection between places as far removed as Karachi in Pakistan, Banaras in UP, Asansol in West Bengal, Jamshedpur in West Bengal, Jamalpur in Bangladesh, and Dhaka. Okay. So, spanning across the subcontinent here. What the narrative will also show is that such widely distributed networks claim to be created by enterprising members of an earlier generation, who made the most of railways and traveled far and wide and established contacts and ties across the subcontinent. The creation of three hostile states in the aftermath of partition made these ties weak and difficult to sustain for the population who became refugees overnight. The subsequent generation of refugees could not have kept this network alive with, by strictly keeping the law. So they traveled in a clandestine manner without an alternative but to bend the law in various ways. This is not peculiar to only the Geneva camp dwellers, but forms an extensive practice among this population. As one respondent said to researcher Insightful, I quote, I went to Pakistan several times through Black Way, Kala Rasta, Kalo Pot in Bangla, without any passport in 1980, 1984 and 1988. Once through the border at Jallo and about going to Bihar, and once through the border at Jallo and once through the border at Kashmir. Quotation close. My respondent spoke about going to Bihar and different corners of India in very similar ways as well as to countries of Middle East. While the population remains caught up in a camp which is a space of exception in the immediate host society, their members try to worm out with fake identities, forged papers, false passports made under false addresses. This helps them to gain access in however limited ways to pan-South Asian and global connections, made up of extended family, contacts and business partners. So here is then how much time has passed.
20 minutes you can take. 15
I
minutes
can
you
take 20 more minutes.
You can take, yeah, 18 minutes you can take.
Yeah, give me half an hour. Here is then one of the areas where life in refugee camp intersects with that of the urban poor. What Chatterjee has pointed out as the domain of paralegality in his very well-known concept of political society. The pertinence of such framing in this case contradicts how the other scholar Redcliffe has set aside Parth's distinction between citizens and population as not of much use for looking at Biharis. Redcliffe is more inclined to see the camp population as making claims to citizenship through these kind of practices, through their different acts, regardless of the fact that these may run against the law. But looking at these exercises as simply claiming rights or performing acts of citizenship, I think runs the risk of overlooking the importance of transgressing the law and legalities that are observed by other citizens, including the duty of not misleading the state, which they regularly do. We will return to the import of this in the next section. But Chatterjee's framing surely helps us to think more closely about what kind of practices come to involve a paralegal dimension. At some risk of deduction, let me say that Chatterjee frames, so I explained political society, but I'm not going to do that with you. I'm going to skip that. The point is, what we don't find in the academic debates on political society are sufficient accounts of what these paralegal acts and behavior empirically are to be found on the ground. This is skipped over, and this is, I think, what our narrative usefully illustrates. They also show a certain degree of normalization of such paralegal practices among the camp population. Most strikingly, there is a strategic relation with law, where one must know how to bend and break the provisions in a manner so as to create the superficial impression of abiding by it. So this is a part of the tactical aspect that I was talking about. Again, as a respondent put it, I quote, I have also had a passport for 11 years with which I have visited India 10 to 12 times, meaning a false passport, by managing the police. So one can see there are various ways of dodging the law, managing the police, tricking the state, known to this population, all of which become necessary for their livelihood and marshalling resources for a dignified existence. However, the paralegality of the urban poor is, according to Chatterjee, accepted by the state out of electoral compulsion in Chatterjee's framing, and their recognition as moral communities. This is where the similarities of Bihari camps with the urban poor and political society come to an end. Because when we look at the state's attitude to this population, it leads us back to Agamben's paradigm of camp, that is marked by complete exclusion, disenfranchisement, and a hovering threat of death over this population. It is not a state of care that we find when we look at the Geneva camp population, but an effective state of abandonment. This population is therefore also an exception even among the local poor, who are not averse to partaking in stray violence, say, lynching against the Biharis, should the occasion present itself. The next section is called Camp and Camouflage, which is, yeah. Um, Recent scholarship has very productively mined the study of different kinds of camp, including refugee and migrant camps, stressing the need to historicize Agamben's framework and highlight differences. One reason for that is the late proliferation of such camps as direct policy outcomes on citizenship. We can see all around us. This has given rise to a growing body of literature on different kinds of camps in Europe and immigration policies of various nations. So beyond the specific singularities of such camps, scholars like Didier Fassin, and I must thank Dipanchika here for introducing me to this scholar, see the camps corresponding to a specific response to problems of public order by instituting small territories of exception. So I talk about what is happening to the French context and a few other contexts. Interestingly, recent studies based on fieldwork in Finland and Jordan find that the question of a refugee identity, I quote, typically surfaced as an openly or implicitly expressed ambiguity between being a refugee and not being a refugee. Okay? So most refugees now are beginning to occupy this ambiguous, ambivalent kind of position vis-a-vis the appellation of being a refugee. This will be important to our narrative. Um, so there is an important vein of work that I refer to, but I'm not going into the detail, which is establishes the Indian state and the subcontinent as closer to a state of care rather than close to Agamben's paradigm. And there's a rich body of studies and scholarships in this line. But I have certain points of important points of difference with this argument, and I think the Geneva camp poses an exception to this assumption of a state of care. There are different kinds of camps, like permanent liability camps, transit camps, and what refugees organized by themselves, some of which turned into refugee colonies in many Indian cities and so on. It is not unlikely, this is my argument, that the biopolitical care of the state considerably varies across the different camps, and there will be certain limit cases to the care of the state. To me, it seems that the Geneva camp in particular and the Bihari camps in general can be seen to present such limit cases to the state of care in the post-colonial context. The reluctance of the state in implementing citizenship granted by court in different spheres of social life shows a decisive and studied indifference consistent with the wider popular sentiment. Marked as the cultural other and collaborator, that is, one who has collaborated with the East Pakistani regime and therefore were against the cause of national liberation, collaborator of political enemy, painted as unwilling to integrate. On the other hand, public opinion variously bolsters the abandonment of this population by the state. One can see the difference subtly between, let us say, the camps in Saidpur, Mirpur, and Mohammadpur. One can see it, for example, in the difference in attitudes and manner of socialization between Mirpur camps and Geneva camps, particularly among the young men. The population in Mirpur camp are also known as Biharis, but their general state of affairs and level of income are several notches higher than that of Geneva. They live in much better housing, built in the East Pakistan period. They have held down jobs. They have run petty trades and business despite all turmoil. They are generally better at speaking Bangla and the cultural social skills to mingle with host society. Most significantly, they call themselves Bangali, distancing themselves firmly from Pakistan and the Bihari identity. Um, Indeed, as we shall see in the following section, some of the elderly even make claims to have taken part in the Bangladeshi nationalist struggle against Pakistan despite being Urdu speakers. There is, of course, a major difference on various questions between the elder generation and the youth, cutting across both camps. Even Mirpur has its own share of skeptic people. Most tellingly, one sees an improvement in the occupational pattern and social aspirations among the young men in Mirpur, who feel more empowered than their parents with service sector jobs that carry a corporate identity. Their camps like Mirpur are closer to the biopolitical type, which can at least hope to be integrated in a slow manner in the host society and admitted at different levels of the local political economy. The Geneva camp stands in complete stark contrast. There's so much more to go. I'm nothing can say. Please let me go quickly through it. Let me describe the contrast of Geneva camp. In my last visit to the camp in 2016-17, it appeared to be frozen in a time war, standing in the middle of mega housing towers, high-end shopping malls, and trendy localities filled with students and smart urban professionals. There was frantic business and bustling activities outside, standard civic municipal facilities of any South Asian capital. But everything looked run down and disintegrating as one entered the camp, inside the camp, with a very sluggish pace of activities or conspicuous lack of activities. Besides the apparent architectural form of the city, it reflected the life of a cluster of marginal villages in the urban periphery, what Mohammadpur used to be before the partition. If one can imagine an island of squalor in urban periphery, surrounded in all sides by the glittering core of a capital city, then we can come close to. Oh, give me a moment.
पेपर चाहिए क्या पेपर 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 मेरे पास है मेरे पास
No worries, no worries. Fine. Um, Besides, so it looks like feels more like a village in the urban periphery. There are more descriptions about the kind of housing and the insides of the camp, which I'm going to skip because they are mostly very redolent of the kind of urban slums that you see in Delhi or in other mega cities. In though especially Muslim kind of neighborhoods, if you look at the squatter formations or slum clusters, they are more or less the same. Um, Unlike the evenly ordered and spaced buildings of Mirpur that house the refugees, um, the physical space of the camp is packed with tapering alleyways and muddy lanes with no natural light. Lately, the matchbox-like rooms are beginning to grow vertically, showing the growing density of population and the new generation's fight for space. How do we see the various acts of faking identities, traveling with forged papers, reporting fictitious address, and all these other ways of bending the law and managing the police in such a context? Pushing the concept of citizenship against its former grain, as I said, Redcliffe has talked about these as acts of citizenship and resistance. While we don't contest the claim of resistance, we consider this framing to be missing a major aspect of the practice, like paralegality, which becomes invisible from the analysis. Redcliffe comes across multiple instances of refugees pretending to be others, hiding from the police, masking their ancestry, masking their identity, fabricating their address, but she does not pay sufficient attention to these. Her account is replete with cases of switching identities, often instrumental. As one resident said, and I'm quoting a respondent from Radcliffe's scholarship, when there is an option to get any advantage out of saying I'm Bihari, I do. Like when there were lots of relief in the camp because there was a fire, I said I was a Bihari. But if I need to do anything outside, I say I'm Bengali. It depends on the demand at that time. So this is termed as a political economy of identification by Redcliffe, but I'm not too convinced by this argument, and I think this is telling. When asked to identify himself, another respondent replies to Redcliffe as saying, I am nowhere, I have no identity. I am not a Bihari, I am not a Bangladeshi, I am nothing. I think this is very, very symptomatic and telling a statement. Such statements I don't think can be interpreted as resistant acts of citizenship. We think they reveal a different kind of act that combines the practice of an ambiguous disposition with what I would like to describe as camouflage. We want to contend that camouflage is the only available condition for escaping the camp. Of course, it means playing with the multiple layers of identities as respondents confirmed above. At the same time, it implies blending with the changing composition of dominant segments of the local population. It involves the ability to be indistinguishable from the background by mimicking others who are in the majority. It is the pathway to physical and social mobility, but one which always carries the risk of being found out and getting identified with the enemy. As we shall see in the section that follows, and this is the final section, the unity section, it is not simply a matter of changing names or making up backstories. It involves betraying painful personal histories and refashioning one's sense of selfhood, neither without internal violence nor without ambivalent emotions. But above all, it means coming across as otherwise than what is oneself to begin with. It is thus a painful self-exercise. So the best way to approach these acts of camouflage is to contextualize how they are played out in a family life spanning generations. This is what I'm going to narrate now as the final piece. Ariful Islam's family. So this is the family that I look at, that of Ariful Islam, which is distributed over two households across two Bihari camps, Geneva camp and Nilpur camp. Ariful Islam was born in 1986. All the coffee. Ariful Islam was born in 1986, educated in Bangla medium and growing up in Dhaka. Ariful is fluent in reading and writing Bangla. Despite his mother tongue being Urdu, Arif writes poetry in Bangla, some of which have also been published in local journals. He has also written up a script and spends his time with young artists and filmmakers of Dhaka, aspiring to be a director. Ariful had quit his job in early 2021 as a customer care executive with a paid food company and is now making plans to start his own business. His family owns a business of manufacturing packages for various companies, and his elder brother works in the finance section of a corporate firm. As such, Ariful's family is a notch better than the typical Bihari households, with a certain degree of cultural and social capital. This capital and this advantage is largely due to the foresight of his grandfather, whose name was Abdul Alim. Abdul Alim had migrated to Bangladesh from Ghazipur in Uttar Pradesh long before India's partition. Being in the business of leather and fruits, the enterprising Mr. Alim developed close network with people living in Jamal, the district headquarters of Maimanshing. Soon he became married to Rahela, the daughter of a Bihari family working and living at the railway junction of Saidpur, another urban hub of Rangpur district in Bangladesh. Kabir Ahmed, Ariful's father, was born to Rahela and Abdul in Jamalpur in 1953. When he was in the 8th standard of a local Urdu medium school in the late 1960s, his father Abdul Alim asked Kabir Ahmed to join a Bangla medium school along with the rest of his siblings. All his family members consequently became fluent in Bangla and had no troubles in relocating when Abdul moved his business to Dhaka after the partition. Such was the degree of their acceptability in the host society that one of Kabir's sisters got married to a Bengali family based in Narinda in Old Dhaka. Kabir took admission at Jagannath College, now university, but could not finish graduation as the war broke out. After the formation of Bangladesh, he started his own business of making packages and got married to Shahzadi, the daughter of Inayat Khan from Banaras, who had also migrated to Jamalpur. Kabir and Shahzadi has 4 sons and Ariful is the second of the sons. The family was housed in one of the camps in Mirpur. And this is based on interviews, multiple rounds of interviews and ethnography, the narrative that I'm laying down before you. Kabir thought that his father Abdul Alim was politically very astute. He was trained at Deoband and enjoyed the company of many eminent personalities. He was deeply influenced by the Khilafat movement, had supported the Congress, and initially opposed the partition. He joined the Jamaat-e-Islami after Pakistan came up, but became disillusioned quickly and quit. In a series of conversations, Kabir explained his father's complex and layered understanding of the partition and history of Bangladesh. According to him, Abdul regarded the partitioning of India on the basis of religion a huge mistake for Indian Muslims. He was convinced that given the social and cultural heterogeneity, Pakistan is not going to survive as a nation for too long. At the same time, he thought the partition had created a real possibility for an independent Muslim state in South Asia. Here was a critical moment of ambiguity that leaned towards the logic of Pakistan despite admitting the fact that it was a mistake. Kabir shared this ambivalent assessment of past with his father. That Abdul Alim was imbued with politics was clear from his decision to change his children's education to Bangla medium, as the language movement began to gather steam. However, this did not protect their family during the Liberation War from going through a total crisis and losing their property. Yet, both father and son decided not to fill in the form for repatriation to Pakistan in 1974, when other family members opted to migrate to Karachi, where they had relatives. The decision was apparently logical for Kabir, who supported Mujibur Rahman's call for regional autonomy in 1966 and allegedly took part in the agitations against Ayub Khan, which eventually led to Bangladesh. That is why, despite the Bihari stigma, Kabir and Ariful claimed to be proud citizens of Bangladesh and refused to live elsewhere. Kabir and Ariful were not the only respondents presenting such a counter-narrative where the Biharis claimed to have been more Bengali than the average Bangladeshi citizen. It is possible that this display of Bengali identity ebbs and flows with the changing regimes of Awami League, BNP and other parties. Other scholarships also show up this phenomenon. This pride about being a Bangladeshi citizen waxed and waned as I kept visiting Kabir's family, where the women of the household did not seem to share a similar enthusiasm for Bangladeshi citizenship. I even sensed a despondency in Ariful when I met him in 2016, who was seriously worried about his future and livelihood. Nevertheless, he resolutely stuck to calling himself a Bangladeshi, even though the whole society was reluctant to admit the likes of him. This optimistic and complicated sense of belonging to the Bangladeshi of families in Mirpur began to give way to a much more dark, more antagonistic sensibility when I met Ariful's relatives living in the Geneva camp. This was the family of his Khala and Khali, maternal aunt Tahira, the sister of Arif's mother Shahzadi, and uncle Ghulam Rasul. Ariful's father is a year older than Tahira's husband Ghulam, and they partly share a similar trajectory. Ghulam was also born in 1954 in Ishordi, the city and headquarters of the western zone of Bangladesh Railway, located in Rajshahi district. He was married to Tahira around 1974 after the formation of Bangladesh, and they have been living in the Geneva camp from when the camp was originally set up. So they were the oldest residents of Geneva camp. Ghulam's father was Muhammad Abbas, who used to work in the railways in Asansol in West Bengal. He had migrated to the railway junction of Jamalpur, where he met Inayat Khan's family, and Ghulam married Inayat's second daughter. But this is roughly where the similarity ends. Unlike his brother-in-law, who claimed to have taken part in the liberation, Ghulam clearly belonged to the other side, aligning with the Pakistani regime. He told me on repeated occasions with barely hidden pride that one of his brothers was a ranking commander in the Razakar army, which collaborated with the Pakistani forces. After this brother was captured and imprisoned, Ghulam paid a huge sum of money as bribe to Bangladeshi army to get this brother released. The man currently lives in Asansol, having reconnected with relatives, leading a happy and prosperous life. Ghulam's family was in regular touch and mutual visits are taking place. Ghulam's family also came across as relatively poorer than Kabir Ahmed, owning fewer consumer goods, living on a tighter budget. But perhaps that is why they were more resourceful at the same time. Although the residents of Geneva camp are not allowed to have passports, Ghulam had a passport under a different address, Soli Tahira, which allowed them to occasionally travel abroad, again, like a large number of senior camp residents. Like many others in the camp, both he and Tahira were registered as voters with their address listed in Jamalpur. They have 6 children with 2 daughters who have moved out of the camp after getting married. Thus, there were opportunities of exiting the camp and pursuing social mobility for the new generation. Yet, their orientation was the very opposite of their counterpart in Milk. Ghulam and Tahira live in the camp together with 4 sons occupying a single room. I'm kind of skipping over the description of this room because it's the usual 6 by at the most 10 feet kind of rooms, and you can imagine what it must be like for 8 members of a family to 10 members of a family to live within that space. So there's a lot of ethnographic detail here about the rooms which I'm passing over. Apart from Ghulam and Tahira, I could talk to Khaled in the family for a few times, who is a young teenager dropping out of school after the 7th standard. Khaled currently helps out with his brother's grocery and does carpentry work on the side. He has cousins who live in Pakistan, and relocating remains an option, but migrating does not appeal to Khaled. Apart from parents, he idealizes a relative on his father's side, Muhammad Ayub, who was born in Pak Circus, who wielded considerable influence and prestige in the area during the East Pakistan regime and became, like many current residents of the camp, the owner of a house in Mohammadpur, which was taken away after the Enemy Properties Act came to place. Similar narratives of disposition of property and business circulate in many households of Geneva camp. Not surprisingly, therefore, the perspective of Ghulam, Tahira, Ayub, and Khalid on the partition and Bangladesh was totally contrary to that of Kabir and Arif. Besides this puzzle of two completely different views in the same extended family, Ghulam Rasul's views appeared more representatives of the residents of Geneva camp. Um, Although few in the Geneva camp were willing to grant me multiple rounds of conversations because they identified me as a Hindu, Bengali, and Indian researcher who they could not fully trust. I had better access to Ghulam Rasul's family partly because I approached them through Arif. According to Ghulam and his family members, by the way, the creation of Bangladesh was basically the result of a grand conspiracy by India. In their version, Pakistan had got the better of India in the 1964 war. So the latter conspired to break up Pakistan and then cynically used Mujibur Rahman to divide up the new Islamic State. As far as they could recall, there was complete peace and harmony between the Bengalis and Biharis during the Pakistan period, which is not strictly true, followed by a spate of unprovoked violence by Biharis. That is when the Pakistani army came to their rescue. It also led the Biharis to avenge their persecution when they got a chance, but eventually the other side displaced and drove them out as Bangladesh came into being. As we can see, it is precisely the version of the past which Kabir Ahmed took pains to distance himself from, to disavow. As a Bihari, Kabir must have experienced similar disposition, but he chose to mask it with another narrative which can facilitate his integration with the host society. Kabir had more reasons than Ghulam to feel bitter. Um, if his claims of supporting Mujib were true, yet he remained stuck to a patriotic narrative, though it was not always without ambiguities. They were not. Ghulam's family insisted they were ready to let go of the bad blood from the past. They were not averse to living in Bangladesh if they were offered proper facilities. Nevertheless, they were equally eager to migrate to Pakistan should the opportunity arise. The ambivalence could not have been more pronounced. Although they were willing to go Pakistan, there was an awareness of being abandoned by that state. While they were stuck in the Geneva camp, the most they could hope for was to reach an understanding with Bangladesh. I come to the conclusion. 5 more minutes of torture. We have every reason to agree with scholars like Redcliffe regarding the Bihari camps as presenting a state of exception in Bangladesh. Where we differ is that we don't consider this reality to depend only on their formal juridical status, which was changed by the court's ruling in 2003 and 2008. The legitimacy conferred on the population by law clearly does not enjoy the acceptance of the wider society, which continues to regard the camp and its population like the source of a contagion. Citizens or not, the camp population must categorically hide their camp address in order to seek out livelihoods and any chance of social mobility. If and when they achieve an entry, like the inhabitants of Mirpur, it is by becoming Bangali and firmly distancing themselves from Pakistan, negating their Urdu ancestry. Even that may not always prove to be sufficient for their rehabilitation. As we have seen, however, the population of Geneva camp presents a case that is more extreme. Their lives are closer to Agamben's concept of Homo Sacer, which can be taken away with impunity because they are associated with Rajakars without so much legal retribution because they are seen as the enemy who has taken lives sacrificed by Bangladeshis during the liberation war. As Biharis who are unwilling to change, they are still seen as agents of Pakistan, identified with the racial and cultural characteristics by the host society that makes them dangerous to trust. I quote, they will betray and stab you in the back. This is something I was told very often. They are practically animals, said some respondents, who are highly educated Bangla-speaking refugees settled in Old Dhaka, who are themselves refugees. This attribution of animal nature is critical in understanding how the population is not only socially barred from exercise of rights, but the more ominous implication is that, as such, they are fit to be culled or sacrificed. No wonder that a fear of imminent death envelops every walk of life in Geneva camp, which leads to desperate and reckless gestures of defying the authority reflected in the narrative of Ghulam Rasul. The blaster of the latter as part of enemy collaborators could well be true, but this sits uneasily with his entreaties for coming to an understanding with the Bangladeshi state. The posture of an enemy is therefore something that is not too far from what we might see as a deliberate wager and ambiguous gesture. This ambiguity runs deeper in the narrative of his brother-in-law living in Mirpur. If Ghulam Rasul appears more loyal to Pakistan than the average Urdu-speaking Bihari, Kabir claims to have been more faithful to the cause of Bangladesh than any average Bangla-speaking Bangladeshi citizen. Both of them articulate in their very own ways what I am flagging here as acts of camouflage. They assume identities that are not only part of the background, which is different in Mirpur and Geneva camp, but that are also excessive and aim to generate confusions. Is it really possible for Ghulam Rasul to carry on with a flag of being an enemy of Bangladesh anymore? Does it make sense for Kabir struggling for acceptance in society after being part of the liberation? Indeed, there are moments when, stripped of these identifications, the younger generation come close to the respondent who said, I am nowhere, I have no identity, I am not Bihari, I am not Bangladeshi, I am nothing. We are then left with only acts of camouflage that produce a constant, dissonant ambivalence. The production of this ambivalence through acts of camouflage, I would like to contain, is the most vital resource of the Bihari refugees. It is what facilitates their clandestine escapes from the camp to other spaces, to other states and wider geographies. As scholarship in other contexts have pointed out already, ambivalence can act as a political resource that is generative of new political relations across the terrain of human mobility and border control. One of the ways in which this ambivalence functions is by clearing up the ground for assuming different identities at different points in time, in keeping with the context. It facilitates a tactical identification and other scholars have marked as a multi-layered identity and opposed to a monolithic community. However, it will be a serious mistake to see this production of ambivalence and camouflage with identities in purely instrumental and superficial terms. They involve very painful reorientation of habits, gestures, and ways of rethinking deep-rooted assessments, as Ghulam is willing to do if his family is offered chances of a dignified existence in Bangladesh. Or what someone like Ariful is struggling to achieve in the place of indifference of a hostile society. In other words, the play with identities and occupying an ambiguous location has serious implications for the refugee selfhood. Unlike other partition refugees, whose sense of selfhood is profoundly rooted, the Bihari selfhood, refugee selfhood, must be opened up to repeated negotiations with identities that help them to survive. The switching of identities therefore implicates vacating and occupying different senses of selfhood. It demands the unlearning and relearning of what we may call linguistic protocols and psychological habitus to begin with. A simple example of this is the growing frequency of Bengali or Bengali names among the younger generation of Urdu speakers. For instance, the two brothers of Ariful, Asif and Rajiv, are known in their localities as Agdum and Bagdum, which are two figures from a popular Bengali rhyme. Somebody introduced as Asif in Geneva camp can become Agdum in Midwood, can take on a different corporate identity of the local gig economy, and perhaps become yet another figure on the social media. Unlike other teenagers, these different identities may not be just fantasy, but vital projects of performance for the Bihari youngsters. The ambivalence they can produce about themselves through such multiple identities becomes the political resource for creating new relations with available resources and access to social mobility. To conclude now, finally, we are not averse to thinking of this as a kind of biopolitical resistance. But what I do is to try and draw your attention to how it involves a tremendous cognitive and affective cost for those who are involved in the process. To occupy an ambiguous position and retain a fundamental ambivalence about identity is more often than not to look at oneself as standing on permanently unstable grounds. The instability of the self is a necessary condition for becoming this or that identity as and when the context demands. We find the haunting admission of this condition in the response we have cited more than once before. I am nowhere, I have no identity, I am nothing. As their life history suggests, both Ghulam and Kabir, and especially their children, are part of this process of hollowing out the sense of the self. The acts of camouflage will otherwise lack in credibility. The play of identities will lack the necessary conviction. We can thus provisionally look at the larger process as a manner of self-exploitation that provides the resources to carve out an existence between their life and citizenship. As we have indicated, similar conditions and practices have already been pointed out by scholars and works undertaken elsewhere. Further comparative research is necessary to test the extent of the generalization of this concept. Thank you. How long did I take up? 1 hour.
एक घंटा से ज्यादा है 1 hour 5 minutes
Captive audience will be accepted.
Okay, I've been introduced, here. I thank the JNU academic organizers for inviting me to discuss this wonderful paper, and I thank Rajarshi for sending me this paper, the published version of this paper. And through that, I also read Victoria Radcliffe's paper, one of the papers which you cite, which is called Abject Origins, Camps, Contests and Creation of Political Space. And Rajarshi's paper is titled Geneva Camp, Dhaka, Bihari Refugees, State of Exception and Camouflage. So in the title of Victoria Radcliffe's paper, we see these two terms, subjects or resins. I think these two terms contain two senses in which we use the term viable. Makes people, communities, object. It also, it's the same thing. Rajarshi's paper also uses both these senses of biopolitics as power over life, capital or state, government, disciplines, in order to control the life's energies, resources. And other sense of biopolitics is, of course, what Rajarshi says, biopolitical acts of resistance. Uh, that's one way in which biopolitics appears. Other way in which biopolitics and biopolitical framework appears is in the contemporary uses of biopolitics, which have moved beyond the classical uh, conceptualizations of biopolitics in Foucault, Agamben, Negri and Hart, and yeah, mainly these. To more recent discussions of informalities, informal sovereignty, as in Thomas Robinson, I think he mentioned, and or political society, these sorts of spaces. I consider Rajarshi's this paper a very important paper. Why I consider this important is because one is, of course, it discusses very important concepts like life and self. Two of these are the most important concepts that appear in this paper, and to handle these two together is, of course, a difficult exercise, but this empirical uh, field provided a possibility of doing that. So, other related concepts that he refers to are identity, territoriality, and the main space of political territoriality that we have now historically for last 4 centuries. That is the space of nation state, right? Which uh, with its promise of citizenship as the main or hegemonic identity. So, of course, what is important in this paper is that Rajarshi's paper is actually trying to show where do we stand historically vis-a-vis nation states and its promise of citizenship by analyzing a space that is at the margins of this paradigmatic and hegemonic space and its promise of citizenship as the hegemonic identity. That's the main frame, and these are the main concepts. And of course, camouflage is one way of understanding, this situation historically. The people are doing that in order to survive in these spaces. And Redcliffe's argument is also resisting. In fact, it's against the idea that people can be reduced as to objects. They are agents. So that's the broadly the situation that in conceptual terms that is understand. And I'll come towards the end of this discussion and raise some questions about camouflage. So first sense of biopolitics is, of course, power over life that Foucault classically describes in several of his books, essays on governmentality and History of Sexuality, Volume 1. That's power over life through, so Foucault is trying to say that the sovereignty had one sort of relation with life that was defined at the extreme of sovereign killing people, spectacle. Right? Now, modern biopolitics or modern politics actually primarily is biopolitics because it moves. There are two new forms of biopower, right? Discipline and government. Right? In other essays, he also says governmentality, particularly that governmentality becomes the main form of these three: sovereignty, discipline, and governmentality of the trinity. And governmentality is the one that actually uses or these other two for its own purpose. So governmentality, which is connected primarily to the government of population, government of species being, that's the, and discipline is, of course, the disciplining of body, right? So then modern power is both individualizing and totalizing. Now, Agamben took these sorts of this Freudian framework in one direction of biopolitics as power over life, and took it to its extreme, but he had to bring in the question that was marginalized in Foucault, that is the question of sovereignty, saying that it's the sovereignty that can create exception, can abandon the law, right, and create spaces of exception where, of course, as Rajarshi described, life, human beings' lives can become available to be killed with impunity. That is exercise of sovereign power beyond law, and that is their right, because protection of law is not available. So that's one sense of biopower. Then other is biopower as the other direction, the affirmative biopolitics of, which is power of life, that is emphasized more in Negri Hart and other scholars' works, which actually tells us about the possibility of resistance within the life. And the evidence for that is within Foucault itself. It's saying that something escapes. Life can never be completely governed. Something escapes, right? So that possibility of resistance and ungovernability against forms of biopower offered by this power of life, that is understood more in terms of possibilities of solidarities and associations produced in the biopolitical spaces. Also of these extreme and abject biopolitical spaces. So the possibility of biopolitics on the other side or from below, and sometimes as an event, right? So they emerge, right? So this is the classical sense in which we can understand biopolitics. But more recent scholarship has also pointed towards pointed out spaces which are not so not so formally organized. So one of these is the concept of informal sovereignty of Thomas Long Hansen, which he says that it's not the formal apparatuses that exercise sovereignty, but informal situations are there in which there is an exercise of sovereignty. Even if law is there, even if some sections of population are recognized as proper citizens, but in situations of informality or informal sovereignty are those where, in spite of formal apparatus of citizenship and protection of law, there is inequality. Some people can exercise sovereign power over other people in an informal way. Basically, the law doesn't work, right? So that's the and of course in Rajarshi's presentation, that aspect is very much there. The other concept that also emerged again not discussed in great detail in this paper, but at present, which is that of Partha Chatterjee's concept of political society, right? Which is a concept which is again space of informality, informal negotiation, violence, and its own forms of community, forms of solidarity, forms of resistance, forms of gaining facilities not as rights but as livelihood, as moral thing there, right? Okay, now I move to the some of the parts of Rajarshi's paper, some of his arguments, key arguments. One of the issues that Rajarshi has raised, and Victoria Redcliffe has also raised, is that this possibility of applicability of the concept of Homo Sacer in a situation of formal citizenship. Because this is mentioned in this paper, but I find that violence, including the violence of informal sovereignty, isn't discussed in great detail in this paper. So my question is, and this is first question, so what is the source of fear of death or imminent death in these sorts of spaces that you are discussing? How does the informal suspension of law happened, particularly after the 2008 Act, which grants it. Okay. Second question is, since the Rajarshi mentions that the biopolitical, it discusses two types of situations. One is the uh, biopolitical type camp situation. The other situation is political society type of situation, and the relation between the two. Now that is not very clear in this paper. So the second question is, how do we understand the political society situation of paralegality in Bangladesh apart from the camp situation discussed in this paper, particularly after the 2008 judicial decision and before that? Okay, now the main conversation of Rajarshi's paper is with Victoria Redcliffe's arguments, and I find that Rajarshi's arguments, despite his critique of Redcliffe, is very close to Redcliffe's argument. Therefore, it's important to understand where the precise difference is, and there are lots of overlaps between these two arguments. So Redcliffe, just like Rajarshi, also so she is also questioning these strong binaries of civil society, political society, legality and illegality, and she is also more than Rajarshi. She is questioning the concept of political society and its applicability and the applicability of paralegality in those situations. Right, and she rejects that political society argument because she argues that not only the solidarity dimension is overemphasized. There are also conflicts. There are also violences and conflicts within the camps and within political societies or informal spaces. Right. So, and also there is overlap with Redcliffe's argument on the question of ambivalence. She also talks about. Now, where are the differences? What is the main difference? The main difference is, of course, I'm repeating that argument, and that I have to repeat some discussing a paper that is already presented. That she calls these acts that all these acts described by Rajarshi, like making a passport, making a license, going abroad, sometimes through legal means, legal means, right? And also now giving wrong addresses. The acts like continuing to hold an illegal passport despite the fact legal is available. How do we understand those situations? So for Redcliffe, these are acts of citizenship, and Redcliffe says it doesn't matter whether these are legal or illegal. These are acts of citizenship because they create political space. The political space is not something that is already given or that can be understood without these acts of citizenship. So in Redcliffe's argument, what I find implicit is the attachment to or the investments in the rights of citizenship, or in what Hannah Arendt calls the right to have rights, which for Redcliffe is understood beyond the rituals of citizenship. And and why these are acts of citizenship? Because they provide access to the facilities and instrumentalities of life through which, or survival through which, people can lead a dignified life. That's what makes them acts of citizenship. Now, whether these can be called acts of citizenship or not, that's what Rajarshi is basically questioning. Now, Rajarshi's critique of Redcliffe. According to Rajarshi, Redcliffe's argument understands the situation primarily in instrumental terms. And Rajarshi calls these acts as acts of camouflage. And Rajarshi's argument is also, and he mentions this more than once, that these acts of camouflage or these acts should be understood in non-instrumental terms. Now, for Redcliffe, these, I think Rajarshi is right. There's an instrumental use of these acts in order to achieve certain acts. That's how we understand instrumentalism. These acts are instruments of arriving at something which is the end, which is something more desired. So now, my question, the third question is, how are acts of camouflage non-instrumental? What other purpose do these acts fulfill? Do the people start believing in these adopted identities? According to Rajarshi's paper, the main features of acts of camouflage are they involve refashioning one's sense of selfhood. They involve internal violence and ambivalent emotions. But above all, these acts means that one has to come across as otherwise than what is oneself to begin with, and therefore it's a painful self-exercise, sort of self-fashioning in those situations. Because they involve painful reorientation of habits, gestures, and ways of rethinking deep-rooted. These also involve vacating and occupying different senses of selfhood, and these acts demand an unlearning of what we may call linguistic protocols and psychological habits. These are some of the features, and the ambivalence of that these acts can produce are about people themselves through such multiple identities. They become that's one of the main arguments again. They become a political resource for creating new relations with available resources and access to social mobility. And finally, these acts are acts of biopolitical resistance at the margin. These are the main arguments. Now, fourth question. The question third was related to these arguments. That how are these arguments non-instrumental or go beyond instrumentality? Because when you say there is tactical flexibility, it's very instrumental. That's you have tactical flexibility. Okay, now fourth question is more a kind of suggestion, if I may, here for further exploring this field. Now, I'm asking, can we go deeper into this ambivalence? This ambivalence. What is there? How do we understand the ambivalence? What does it point towards? So answering this question becomes important in my view if we have to go beyond the instrumental value of these accesses. So, for the argument about acts of camouflage to go beyond mere instrument value, they need to be related to issues of belonging, sense of the self, that is connected to some bigger identity than the individual self or individual self. So, implicitly I am asking what sorts of communities these acts are giving rise to through the camouflage. Because when we ask communities beyond individual instrumentalization, then of course we can think of going beyond instrumental value. Now, two kinds of questions and possibilities emerge here. One is the question of affective investments, attachments, and hope offered in the citizenship regime of the nation state. What does this situation indicate vis-a-vis these questions of effective investments and attachments and hope that people have with the promise of the nation state? That's the historical question. So what does this situation indicate? Do these people want to move away from such investments and invest in something else? Into something, the horizons of which we still don't have, or can't see, which are hazy, something that is to come. So do they indicate a new possibility on the horizon of new community formations, or moving beyond the promise of this is the last one. Moving beyond the promise of nation state, particularly in the context of globalization and historical challenges facing the nation state and its. For instance, Peter Sloterdijk has argued in an essay called Immunological Transformations on the way to thin world societies. So that's one horizon. He's mapping. Thin, from thick world nation state is a thick world society, towards a thin world society. So, not that strong sort of identities, not those strong senses of belonging, but weaker, maybe multi-layered, but weaker, thinner walls. So do they want to get out of attachments and investments in citizenship altogether? Because that's I think your paper is merely indicating, but not really going into that. But that's a possibility. Another way of thinking about it is that what happens, in different sorts of situations of, because situations are not same or similar in politics. So Veena Das, for example, talks about waning and waxing of intensity, to which the acts of ordinary life change. Waxing meaning the political involvement into political events which are mediatized, where possibilities of violence, possibilities of othering become intense. And of course, when the situation returns back to the normal, waning of intensities, then of course the solidarities and known hegemonic modes of actions, political resources available, and people begin to exercise. So these are my basic questions. Thanks again for the invitation and
Let me do something. Thanks to Mohinder. Let me do something. I have taken down Mohinder's questions, but if there are any pressing questions from the house, from the audience, I'm happy to take them in and come to his questions at a later point. Any questions, anybody? Okay. So please, set the ball rolling.
Related to Professor Singh's question, uh, I, I was not clear. I mean, in the whole paper, the discussion how it. I have not read the paper, but I got it. The the discussion on state was not so much. I mean, the Bangladeshi state, or how is the nature of the how it is. I mean, because that's one important actor in the whole game of their lives. I thought that discussion was not so much. When you were talking about the prejudice of other communities against this Bihari population, but what about what is the official nationalism of the state? I mean, where in the official nationalism narrative, where are these communities situated? In that sense, I thought the prejudice of the state, or that did not came out that much in the presentation. Secondly, uh, I just want to know that if the 2008 Act, which gave them citizenship, I mean, if historically there has been stripping off of life, or in a sense certain meaningful life means of livelihood from this section of population, then why was this citizenship given to them in 2008? I mean, they were recognized that they are part of the nation state, or they're part of the larger uh, national community. So in that sense, how much is the whole frame of state of exception, and does that not contradict the whole frame of, if it is stripping off that, then does that not contradict the frame of state of exception? That just
I don't really have a question regarding the paper, and I'm straying away a little bit from the state. So, is there any sort of power projection within the definition of the UNHCR refugee? Like when they say well-founded fear of persecution, who decides whether the fear is well-founded or not? And is this sort of power dynamic reflected in this disintegration between who's a refugee or not a refugee? So, is there some sort of power dynamic within that, defining who a refugee is?
Okay. Yes.
I was wondering if the term camouflage assumes the stability and materiality of a background which one camouflages, and if isn't I was just wondering if identity doesn't it itself produce its own ambiguity in different to different degrees, but the production of identity itself producing ambiguity. And another question was in relation to fantasy.
I didn't get that. Identity itself producing ambiguity.
Its own ambiguity, like any production of identity also producing its own ambiguity.
Can you take an example?
In the sense, if I say I am a woman, then it produces the ambiguity of what is woman. Like
But that's not ambiguity. It may beg the question what is a woman, but that's not ambiguity.
But it, like if I have to assert that identity, it also means that I am in some way participating in the ambiguity of what it means to assert that identity. So in that way, isn't it sort of like doesn't it hold its own negation in some respect to different degrees? Like you were saying that maybe it's very apparent and pronounced elsewhere, but that was in relation to the stability of a background identity, of stable identity, the materiality of the existence of stable identity as such. The second question was in relation to Munder's question about instrumentality. Why the disapproval of fantasy? And I was wondering the statement that one of your respondents made that I am nobody, to say that in the 21st century, isn't that fantastical and at the same time full of vitality? Why does fantasy not have vitality, and why is that?
To say that I'm nobody is fantasy.
In the premise, it's like considering the paper that you're presenting in relation to biopolitics, to say that you are nobody in this world today is in that sense a kind of productive impossibility, right? Like it's not possible to be nobody, but like it is in that sense fantastic. And I was wondering if that is not full
Let
of
me give you a
vitality.
quick response here. It would mean, the second thing would mean basically that I am not recognized as anything. For the world, I'm not a Bangladeshi, I'm not a Bihari, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Urdu speaker, I have nothing, I'm nobody. This is all addressed to us. Okay, so it's not talking about the self in that sense. Okay. I'll come back to your other question later. In Ram and then after that.
But I wanted to begin with the usage of the word camouflage. So, camouflage is it appears like a very negative word. But it is a negative word because if we look at the whole usage of camouflage, it is like chameleon. So we generally look at chameleon, it is like okay, you are simply shifting your colors to save yourself from maybe a predator. Maybe the predator would be the different state, maybe the nationalism, maybe the linguistic identity. But here, because you are differentiating this idea from the idea of resistance, it is not particular, it is not an act of resistance, and yet we are using it as a negative quality. The precarity is being again being verified in one way or the other. In other senses, with regard to the usage of the identity, that I know like no one or being even human being, just being a human being or there human being, without the kind of context of, without the recognition conferred to the nation state or the idea of citizenship, this idea becomes very kind of idealistic or very, it appears good, it appears very,
Which idea?
that I am nobody, that idea of nobody, even the idea of nobody is of camouflage, very it appears good, but it does not have any kind of value in itself. It might be a very important assertion in your interview, but in terms of existence, it is no value. Because the way in which citizenship is being shaped is very different. So in that sense, and there is also a note, for example, we all are human beings, we are not just out of one nation or the other. This idea is also very ridiculous at this point of time. In that note, if you are adding a value to the idea of nobody, to the interview, what is that value there? Or if you are going with the flow that we are human beings, then
No, we are human beings is not there. The contrary is true. They are looked upon as animals.
so, because you are using the idea of camouflage, this is what I was concerned with. What is it? What are you really using? So the camouflage is hinting towards a certain kind of negotiation, certain kind of existence. Is that existence of person of self which is trying to identify with a form of what is that form? Is that form human being? Is that form
That form is Bangladeshi citizens. People who recognize each other as Bangladeshis and not as Biharis.
but again there is a context of a Geneva camp.
Yeah.
Again, there is also idea of internationalism,
No, but they are not qualified as refugee. Right at the beginning of the paper, this is something that I said. They are stripped of citizenship rights in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and in India. Therefore, they are not regarded practically as refugees. Which is why the significance of the term stranded Pakistan. Both. Stranded Pakistanis is a term that is primarily used by international bodies and the nation state, but not by the society at large. The same population are called animals, Biharis, so on and so on. Okay, so I'm going like this, okay? Rajarshi. Oh, you have a question. Yes.
Yes, sir. Except that idea of nobody, sir. Are you looking at in the context of statelessness of these, or is it like they, or is it in the relationship of the state to the individual, or the individual sense of what they want to belong, but they are not being called something. They want to become citizens, but they are not. So what is, I was little ambiguous of the term nobody. Of what in the sense it
It means both. It means both. It means the state doesn't recognize me as citizen, as its citizen. It also means that the society around me does not accept me as one of its members. And I am too tired to be called a Bihari, to be identified as a Bihari.
But
So if you are asking me where I stand, I am nobody. I stand nowhere. I have no local standard. I am nobody actually means in that case that I don't have any local standard.
yes, sir. But sir, what if happens hypothetically? If someone does not want to have an identity attached to the state, let's say I am okay. I don't want to be as is that a possibility, sir? That will be a very
That is a
hypothetical.
different possibility. I'm not saying that that cannot be there, but that is not what is expressed through I am nobody.
Okay.
So insofar as we are glossing this particular utterance,
Okay.
that's the same.
Okay.
Okay?
So I have two
Yeah.
So you put an interview a lot of women. So I was wondering why that is the case. Why were you not being able to access women, or were they not willing to talk to you, or what were the problems there? And the second question was, when you were talking to these people, I'm assuming you were talking to them in Bangla. So was that also something, since the language politics you brought up that they were a little apprehensive of you because you were talking to them in Bangla? So how did you deal with that problem in the sense that because they saw you as a Bengali, so then how do you deal with that?
This also saw themselves as Bengalis, many of them. But it is not necessary that I always spoke to them in Bangla. When I was talking to the elder generation, I switched to Hindi. The language that they appear to be more comfortable with. Okay, so that's the answer to your second question. First question, I'm going to come back. Okay, um, he had a question, and then I'm coming back to that.
Had a question about when displacement study is the concept of low violence. Low violence in the sense that you don't invest materially in a space to better your condition. Your case study points towards that there is also the low violence in the realm of cultural identity, in the realm of ideology. Can you comment on that?
What do you mean by slow violence? It's not a concept that I'm familiar
Slow
with.
violence means, for example, just displacement, a patch of land, this portion of its legality. People might be displaced from it. People will not necessarily invest in it, like you will लगाएंगे जैसे Similarly, but your case study shows that people are not investing in their identity to begin with. That's a byproduct of the society's low violence that is coming about. So can you, we think that is
I'll try to kind of engage with you as much as I understand this. Yes, Varun, and then him, and then you. Yes, Varun.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, like, is this conception of governmentality or biopolitics, how is it different from necropolitics? Like, I'm seeing knives is dispensable the way actually Agamben and people like this. Are they same or is there some nuance?
Okay. What about you?
When you talk about this grown up movements, like, now, this zone, people, those who are living in this zone, they create their own politics. So they have to preserve their historical. For example, when Nazi concentration camp, how Jews used to preserve their
I can't hear you. Just speak up a little bit. Nazi concentration camp?
like how the Jews they preserve their history and tradition. Or like when they talks about these tea plantation workers in Africa, how they preserve their ritual. Is there any sort of evidence in the research of how they preserve their ritual? Because outwardly they can't express it. It's labeled as Nazi. So another question is that now how do you distinguish between acts of citizenship and acts of resistance as James Scott has called it? And I mean, is there an overlap between these two in your research?
Yes.
The Chatterjee is conceptualizing political society more as an empirical space marked by the predominance of non-corporate capital, but Nivedita is suggesting that political society is more of a distinct style of political engagement, which is much more fluid, contextual, and it's transcendental of class distinction. So can the politics of camouflage be fed into this conception of political society? This is my first question. And my second question is that like when they are identifying themselves as Bengali, don't you think, I mean the Bihari standard, don't you think that they are also at the same time taking part in the very homogenizing, modernizing march of the nation state? But within like within the family narrative, do you find any aspect of resistance to that, to the integration to that very history of the nation? Are there resistance based on galvanizing upon the very Bihari attitude by the Bihari?
I didn't get your question. Can you say it again?
So like when they are identifying themselves as
When they're going to get killed, if they call themselves Bihari, how do you expect them to kind of organize and build upon their Bihari identity. And it's precisely the Bihari interpolation that threatens them everywhere. So,
Sorry. So what is it which allows this kind of camouflage to happen? Like for instance, is it the court ruling which grants them some sort of right but it is not applied? Is it which allows these kind of tactics to play out? And if one wants to extend your this conception of camouflage to others campsites, so can we extend it? Like for instance, under those conditions where there is no legal backing in terms. And secondly, can these acts of camouflage sustain the kind of information surveillance that is coming in? So, to what extent these camouflaging can sustain themselves if the state tries to do this? So, why is it that the state is so indifferent? Is the state not aware of these camouflaging acts? Or, yeah,
okay, thank you. Somebody is still raising hand. Yes, please. Just speak up a little.
There are official assembly bodies in Pakistan. What is the position of Pakistan towards these people? One. And second, when you say expanded,
The first, let me answer the first. It will disavow. Pakistan doesn't accept them as stranded Pakistanis. And the second question?
second, what can be the reconciliation between expanded Pakistanis and stateless people? And how can you go beyond?
You don't need to reconcile them. They are stateless people. Stranded Pakistanis are stateless people of a kind.
But what is then expanded Pakistanis?
That's a legal appellation.
Historical nostalgia. One. Second, how to go beyond this? Is anyone
Beyond what?
beyond this changing phase of nation state? One. And second, how can people be stranded cosmopolitan in the context of changing phase of nation state?
I'm not sure. Let me now start responding. I'm not sure whether I can answer your question within the scope of this paper. Insofar as stranded Pakistanis or the population group I described, we are looking at a, in some terms, in some more or less, and in some sense, stateless people. Because they're disowned by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all three nation states. And so they don't have citizenship rights. To very quickly kind of somebody would ask me about I think it was Supri who talked about the citizenship rights. So let me see if I can remember the question, and at the end I'll come to the questions raised by Mohinder. So Supri, what was your question about prejudices of the state?
prejudices of people were there in the paper.
Oh, right.
But the
You
state
thought that the
narrative.
state narrative was missed. The narrative of the state was not missing. I was more focused on the social kind of hostility because the state is not really, in the sense in which we understand it, it's not really a separate, hermetically sealed, different entity which can be abstracted from the society. It is an effect in some sense. And more often than not, when you look at what the society is doing, for example, if you look at rising the instances of lynching, you are, you can work out with impunity. You can work out what is the state's attitude towards it, whether explicit or implicit, whether it is said or not. So the state's stand towards this population is the root of some trouble because. Yeah, can you just go easy with the conversation at the back? Okay. We will come back to this after that. The fact that the state can also be seen as segregated, differentiated, so on and so forth. So the stand of the state in general is that these are collaborators of the Pakistani regime. Okay. Now the question becomes critical when we come to the following generations who were born after Bangladesh was created, or who were born after the war. This is the population that the state had kind of given citizenship rights to or voting rights to. Okay, but the local polling officer has refused to empanel the others. So the other layers of the state are kind of blocking the path, blocking the passage. And one of their reasons is that because they say they cannot differentiate truthfully between who were really born after 1971 and who were not, because it is in the interest of the subject population to fudge these facts and so on. So, although one can see certain degree of mobility beginning to take place, it is practically nothing has changed in so far as their status is concerned. Even after, this is why I said that I was doing my film about 10 years after the war, and I didn't see a difference, much of a difference. So the granting of the citizenship rights has made this population uh, somewhat vocal about articulating these rights and more conscious about what the, but there is no way in which they can enforce this articulation. They can make it work on the ground, okay? Because on the ground, a very different kind of situation persists, which lump them together as Biharis, as Gaddar. There are various terms for it, as you know, those who betrayed the liberation, so on and so forth. And many of them were part of Razakar army formations. Okay? So that's, I think, your. There was a question from somebody about who decides who are the refugees. Your question. In this case, there's nobody really who's deciding who are the refugees. There are some international definitions, but you know that the case of partition is very strange because in the case of partition, there is, first of all, we don't have any law about refugees. We have laws about enemy evacuation, that Properties Act, so on and so forth, but we don't have proper laws about refugees. And therefore, you would find some government documents which are dealing with the rehabilitation, referring to them as refugees. But as you go up the ladder, you don't see corresponding kind of documents talking about the refugees as an acknowledged kind of population. So it's kind of wide open to international interventions and um, uh, I suppose kind of the willingness of the legislative process to enact some law to this effect. So nobody takes responsibility for identifying the refugee. People are more keen to take responsibility for identifying the migrant and the illegal immigrant than the refugee. And it's crazy because you are looking at a constant sort of flow outflow of people from 1947 to nearly 1960s, so for about 15 years, constant flow of people, and that continued even after that. So this kind of complicates the picture. There was some question about camouflage and the background. You were asking. Yeah, so it's something like this. Think about it at the firstly at the empirical level. Okay, all of you assembled here may not be students in the same sense. Okay, may not be students in the sense in which all students must be rigorous, all students must be attentive, all students must do up, the literature, reading, so on and so forth. But the sense in which I was talking about camouflage is that if I try certain things which amount to passing myself off as one of you, rather than as a teacher. So that's what constitutes the background. In fact, there's a very interesting, funny film, old film by Woody Allen called Zelig, which is about this person who suffers from a chameleon phenomenon. So when he is moving around with Jewish rabbis, he starts looking like a Jewish rabbi. When he's kind of talking to the Chinese delegation, he starts looking like a Chinese person, so on and so forth. So it's a bit like that. It does not theoretically or philosophically imply that the background is unchanging, stable, and solid, but background only in with regard to a pattern which a person can, let us say, put on in order to be undifferentiated from that background. That's the sense in which I was talking about camouflage. And it has a slight bit of a military connotation as well, combat connotation as well. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Somebody else had the question about chameleon and why is it not resistance? Right? Ram, you had the question. Now, I'm not saying, and this is a larger question because this is a question that in some sense Mohinder has also raised. Um, I'm not saying that it is not resistance. Okay. So I'm conceding that this might be looked at as, and it has been by this other scholar, Redcliffe, seen as a resistance. I have a different reason for disagreeing with her describing it as acts of citizenship, okay, because I don't see acts of citizenship coming to include the translation of citizenship laws pertaining to citizenship. If that is act of citizenship, then it's very difficult to distinguish between citizenship and breaking the code of citizenship. If we take away the distinction between the two, but insofar as resistance is concerned, I am trying to think of a situation. I think this is my understanding that we are perhaps beginning to become somewhat cramped in our imagination of the kind of practices that we find in the social margins when we think primarily in terms of exploitation and resistance or oppression and resistance. It creates a kind of heuristic binary. So that after that, when we go into the field, we look for facts which will, fall into either of these overheads. And we shore up those facts. And my apprehension is that it is precisely what Radcliffe does. This makes her not pay attention to the multiple instances where she sees people pretending to be some other person, or faking to be some other person, or using false papers with different names. She herself kind of, gives multiple instances of these acts. But once she has made up her mind about all of these as resistance, she is not looking at these acts in a very specific way. So my conviction is that what if we open up? Now let me kind of step back theoretically and say, in Agamben, I think there is a very tight passage between being bare life and death. So you either live as bare life or you are marched into the gas chamber and you are gassed to death. It's a very quick and immediate passage. Now, what I am trying to do here, thinking and trying to do here, is to open up an interval between these two, between bare life and death. Okay? A theoretical interval of possibilities, other kinds of possibilities. And there, I think that one can begin to identify certain acts which some people can see as resistance or not see as resistance, it doesn't matter to me that much, but which I would perhaps attribute, I think, with more accuracy to something like acts of persistence. That I refuse to die, that I refuse to surrender entirely. That within this situation, I am trying to make the maximum, gain the situation, and at least delay my imminent death. Okay? Within a totalitarian kind of a situation. So that's where I'm trying to lead with the. That's where I'm trying to lead with the question of camouflage. That's the kind of act that I'm thinking of camouflage as an act of persistence, which is also an act of, kind of in some sense combat that is happening with the society and the state. But resistance does not exhaust all the possibilities of what this act is, or does not help us to understand what this act and the limits of this act also are. Because beyond the point, they are not going to go and challenge the prejudices of the society or the diktats of the state. They are biding time, these kinds of acts. They are making do. They are kind of seeking out ways to survive within a state of affairs, within a very, very severe kind of state of affairs. Does that help your question? I'll come back to you in a moment. Okay, so the question of nobody as a fantasy. Somebody had that question, you had that question. I think I explained that. I mean, here, In fact, it's the opposite. If you think that in the 21st century, with all the surveillance systems and with all the kind of information pooling, we are moving towards a situation where everybody is somebody to be identified, then I think you'll be increasingly surprised to see that everybody invariably includes a segment of outsiders who are nobody, who count as nobody within the included everybody. So it's not really a fantasy, it's more of a nightmare in that sense. At least in this case, when the respondent says, I'm nobody, there is a certain resignation in that person that makes him say these words. I could not access women. I could not access women because the context that I'm talking about is kind of within the camp. It's like a state of emergency, and the women folk are mostly indoors. Okay, they are more scared and they are more skeptic than their men folk who move out, and which is why they are also not enthusiastic about saying that yes, we are Bangladeshi citizens. They are far more stoic, and as far as I could get it, they are more keen on holding on to their identity as Urdu speaking. Though they understand that this is making situation increasingly difficult for their younger generations, but I just wish that I had been a woman, because these kind of interviews need a certain degree of rapport and trust. That rapport, without that rapport and trust, you cannot begin to ask these questions and elicit meaningful answers. They could have answered if I had done a survey among them, but that wouldn't have gotten me to these kind of insights. This thing about slow violence that you talked about. Why did you think that this was a case of slow violence? Can you explain once again?
When you say that they have to unlearn, they are not investing in their historic identity. Urdu speaking Bihar, and they have to invite some other kind of, so they have to invest somewhere else or not investing to begin in that. The and it, the concept has been used mostly in material sense, but your case study I was applying that's to the cultural ideal sense. And the question was, can we use this concept in this regard?
Yeah, apart from it can certainly. Apart from the fact that I think that the phrase slow violence does not quite capture the intensity of it, which is closer to something that I think Varun was asking about necropolitics. This is very close to a necropolitical situation. There is no doubt about that. It's a whole lot of things that we will talk about, morbid conviviality and so on and so forth, applies to this kind of a situation. But I did not go down the path of necropolitics because, see, I was trying to carve out an in between. On the one hand, there is Radcliffe, and then there is James Scott, and all these theories who are talking about resistance, which are very inspiring, but to my mind, a little too easily. Okay, I don't see any good reason to, for instance, think of an act of escape immediately as an act of resistance. It is theoretically sufficient for me to look at it as escape and stick with that and then think that through. Because resistance is almost, kind of where you neatly tie up the ends of all the phenomena that you're looking at. So I was avoiding that polarity, and I was also interested in avoiding this polarity that is there in necropolitics, which is very close to Agamben's descriptions of the concentration camp. And which is very true of the African situation, more true of the African situation, I would say, than the subcontinental situation of the Philippines. Somebody asked how they preserved their rituals, but I think he's gone. Acts of citizenship and acts of resistance. So I'm taking out that. Political society. Somebody asked me about. Yeah. You see, I'm somewhat familiar with Vedita's kind of critique of Marxist political society, but I'm not convinced by that.
That also doesn't accept.
That's separate. I mean, my point is that I don't see there is a very interesting line of argument which identifies certain kind of modalities of work by political society, for instance, paralegality, has also been found in the civil society segments who also do illegal kind of things. But there's a difference, huge difference between the two, to my mind. The difference is that when the civil society member does it, she knows that she's doing an illegal act. But when the population of political society do these things, they do these things because they have no other alternative. And they cannot be bothered beyond the point whether this is paralegal or whether this is legal. There is a different kind of moral claim that is woven into it, which is not there in the case of civil society. And so I also don't see it as a question that can get rid or shed its class dimension in some sense. So that would be my, and if you ask me that, what kind of political, I mean, think of it. Do you see members of middle class and upper middle class, not professional criminals, traveling with false passports? Would they even think of taking such a risk, even when they have a legal passport? Would they have multiple sets of identity papers? I very strongly doubt. I very strongly doubt. Because they know that all these things are being on the other side of it. They can immediately go to jail if they find out. And these people have, very little to lose in that sense. Which is why they try out all these kind of evidence. And because they cannot try out legal evidence. Even if the younger generation of the Bangladeshis who are born after the war are given some kind of rights and therefore they might apply for passport, what is going to happen to the elderly generation who were part of the Bangladesh-Pakistan war? What options do they have? The only option is to kind of exercise these paralegal kind of practices in some sense. What allows camouflage to happen? Information surveillance. That was your question. See, as you see with the paper documentary regime, and so far we are looking at with the kind of digital information regime. The more you proliferate these regimes, okay, the more people seem to find out ways of hoodwinking, of outfoxing, of cleverly dodging these regimes. For instance, when you make a paper document called identity card, Aadhaar card, as mandatory for all the authentic citizens, there are scores of people who are carrying fake Aadhaar cards. There are even people who are very likely to have multiple Aadhaar cards. Similarly with the passport. So the more you have the surveillance system in place, and the more you have information, the more you have a plethora of information which at least the state machinery in the subcontinent, I don't think has the wherewithal to process and efficiently operationalize on the ground. Because that is where corruption, bribery, all of these things come into. That is where the lower levels of the state begin to become porous. Okay? And so these people, this is why I use a term called warming out from the system. Okay? So if you know how to drive a policeman, for instance, you can jump to traffic signals and get away with it. It may be kind of driving $100 to a traffic constable. What you did was kind of illegal. But since you know that this is how it works on the ground, that instead of giving me a challan, you'll be happy with 100 rupees. You take advantage of it. Now let me turn to the questions raised by Mohinder. And some of your questions were also kind of overlapping. Can I handle these questions and then come to you? Yeah. Mohinder, let me admit to begin with that I have not really thought through the relationship between political society and biopolitical society very, very clearly, apart from the fact that I find the empirical contexts of political society characterized by a certain kind of spectrum of biopolitics, both in terms of the power over life and life's exercise of power, of innate kind of power. So that is the bit about, but I'm going to kind of think more closely about this relationship in the coming days. When you ask me about what is the source of fear which makes the category of Homo Sacer applicable, then the source of fear is this, that they are identified as traitors to the nation's cause. Okay? And they are not only identified in those terms by the state, but they are identified even more extensively by the host population, by the host society, who also see in this a kind of convenient political economic arrangement where you can kind of keep Bihari laborers working, for 12 hours, 14 hours at a stretch and pay him a pittance. So they all have their instrumental uses too. But the source of fear is this, that you have no right to be living here and you are actually somebody who has betrayed this land, betrayed this nation, you have collaborated with the enemies to kill our own. Therefore, although we are entitled to kill you if the need arises. And there are several massacres that have happened. I have not gone into the details. This is very unsavory details of several massacres and lynchings that have taken place even after the Bangladesh war, targeting the Biharis. So taking away their properties as well as taking over their businesses. Not very different in some sense from the 1984 anti-fake riots in Delhi. Okay. So camouflage. Why do I say that it's non-instrumental, and why do I think that it cannot be done for purely instrumental reasons? So as I was trying to hint here, that my reasoning is, and it's probably not entirely a very foolproof idea to call it camouflage, because you can take on a camouflage and you can take off a camouflage without your body undergoing any serious change. But when I'm talking about this as camouflage, then, as you said, there are grave implications for one's selfhood, for one's deep sense of identity, and which produces, firstly, let us say, a huge amount of anxiety that if there is any context where even a glimpse of my Bihariness or my camp dweller identity gets leaked out, then I am going to be purged out of this, purged out of the larger society. So I'm constantly trying to hide all those signs and traces in me and pass myself off as any other local Bangladeshi lad or child. But when I go back to the Geneva camp and I talk to my parents, many of these families, obviously talk in Urdu. Okay? Talk to my parents, and there is a certain amount of getting in touch with cousins living in Pakistan and so on and so forth. I'm once again wading into that older history. I'm wading into that older sense of identity. So what I was trying to say, and I avoided the term because it would have gotten too dramatic, but there is a self-mutilation that is constantly happening. There is a wounding of the self that is constantly happening. That is the cost of this camouflage. Which is why I find it difficult to think of it in instrumental terms, purely instrumental terms. What source of communities do these camouflages give rise to? That was one of the questions that you raised, and then I'm going to come to the major question. Well, I mean, the doors it opens up this kind of camouflage is basically two kinds of doors. One is to identify and to feel part of the Bangladeshi youth. So a large number of these, for instance, participated in the recent demonstration in Shahabad, which was a major kind of issue. So they want to be part of the larger political ethical community called the nation. On the other one hand, okay? They want that. At the same time, they also want to become part of a international community of which Bangladeshis are a part. They have recourse to a different kind of cosmopolitan identity, we should remember, which is connected to these Muslim countries going up to the Middle East and which have their sacred geographies and so on and so forth. But they also, especially with neoliberalism, the more they are getting sucked into the service sector jobs and economies and so on and so forth, these aspirations are making them increasingly wanting to be part of the modern national kind of community, and a community that can aspire with reasonable grounds to prosper, to have a life of their own. Um, Now, your question was, so what happens to the affective hopes and investments in the nation state? And you talked about Sloterdijk's thin-walled kind of a world in this context. Do these people want to give up citizenship? This is very interesting. So, I think these people do not want to give up citizenship. Neither do these people want to kind of jump into the wagon of citizenship. This is the part where their kind of capacity for negotiation comes. So they are unwilling to let go of the fact that this nation has treated us unfairly. Okay, albeit we were, we were supporters of the older regime, but for the last 70 years, this nation has treated us extremely unfairly. So the moment the state says that here is your citizenship, I'm not going to kind of run to its flat or run into its arms. Okay, I'm going to kind of take my time, look at the terms and conditions that are associated with it, so that it doesn't become a purely nominal kind of an exercise. But at the same time, I recognize the goods of substantive citizenship. I have an imagination of what life is available to such citizens when I look at the Bangladeshi population, even outside the camp. Okay, so there is, I wouldn't call this ambivalent. I would call this, once again, to take off from this one term I used in the title, tactic. So here, what I meant by tactic is that there is not a long-term game plan of what we are going to do with the nation state and vis-a-vis our status. But there are short-term kind of ploys and practices to deal with the situations. And we are also, so there is a certain kind of incapability also to think in terms of 10 years from now. But there is an intense cultivation of the capability to think of 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, sort of. Which is why I'm calling this, I'm qualifying all these moves as tactical kind of moves. For two reasons. One is that they are not what they pretend to be, what they appear to be. So there is a tactical use of the move that one is making. And the second sense is that they are also not reflective of a long-term strategy from which they are arising. They are very contingent. They are very contingent because, and here I am borrowing from you when we were having the conversation the other day, because among other things, I think very strongly they have probably clued into the nature of the neoliberal state much more than the rest of us. They are giving up on the idea of a social welfare state continuing any longer. So what are the benefits that a citizen can wrangle from a neoliberal state, which is constantly teaching it to be responsible for its own earning? Which is what they're doing. They're taking responsibility for their own livelihood, which involves these legal translations. But they don't want to go back to this kind of realm of hope, where once they can establish themselves as citizens, they are looking towards getting certain packages, benefits, policies, reservations, so on and so on. That is gone. Something like that. So that's indeed maybe my responsibility. You had a question? Yeah. Carry on, then I'll.
All right.
Yeah.
So actually, just thinking within that context that you have provided about education, and also within the context of other international.
No problem. Thanks for coming.
In other contexts of PPP, like nationalism, thinking also of clandestine rules, like rules of refugees, and they actually cross from city to other city. That passage of, for example, sea or like thick forest. To what extent that help actually the process of reducing them into their animalistic identity, the animal identity.
This passage.
That, for example, that passage where they are not in a city, neither within a city nor within the camp, but rather in the passage.
Okay.
For example, in the journey, right? Or, for example, crossing the forest in the next. So how can this be done? Like, the what we call it, animal animal and if this also can be looked at, this is the second question. How can this being reduced into the animal help in that camouflage, using the camouflage technique? I'm thinking over here of the werewolf, but they also exist in the forest. And this is something also Agamben himself has mentioned. And actually, Homo Sacer itself has this kind of meaning. The figure itself has this kind of meaning of having the virus or the werewolf.
Having
The meaning of the virus, werewolf, right? So which has this meaning of camouflage, right? As a practice. The last thing I was thinking is the type passage you mentioned about between life and death, resist, or rather than resistance. I was thinking also that it was the Muslim or the Muslim that is mentioned in the
remnants of Auschwitz.
yeah. So I was thinking because Primo Levi himself he mentioned that this figure is resisting life and at the same time resisting that kind of death that and he is always existing in the camp. So to what extent that also can be.
Thank you. Let me clarify. Thank you for this. Kind of. I think the second and third were more like helpful comments. That I didn't think in those directions, especially around Homo sacer's proximity with the werewolf sort of thing. See, because I was using this metaphor of them being talked about as animals in a specific sense, in a sense of the host population radically othering this Bihari population, and where talking about them as animals was a way of reducing or erasing the culpability of killing them. Where it makes animals are more easily sacrificiable. So which is why we find Nazis calling Jews as vermins and pests, and we have kind of modern, more recent kind of avatars of them as termites and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a topological kind of use by the figures in the state very often to disenfranchise and to kind of completely expose to sovereignty, to push them to that bareness. Okay? But what you are talking about is a different sort of reference to the animality which their existence may get reduced to or transformed into when they are, let us say, traveling or taking this dangerous passage, trying to cross from mestizo, the border as clandestinos. So that's a different kind of experience where the question of animality is lodged in them and in their probably self-perception in some sense. I didn't kind of go there, but I'll definitely try to think about it. Now the point is that when you talk to the Biharis, this is perhaps not surprising, but very instructive, that they claim precisely the opposite about themselves, that they are extremely skillful craftsmen. They have very sophisticated kind of traditions. They have a very sophisticated language to converse. They are part of a different civilizational network. Okay, and they therefore consider themselves. Many of them consider themselves as much better than the Bangladeshi, than the ordinary. Certainly much better than the Bangladeshi low-caste Hindu. That's out of the question. But themselves as much better even as Muslims than Bangladeshi Muslims. Okay? So they in a way they kind of claim of different kind of aristocratic lineage, bits of which popped up in Ghulam Rasul's kind of testimony when he was proudly talking about how his brother is a Razakar and so on and so forth. So the point for him is that whether he should condescend to accepting an offer from the Bangladeshi state or not. That's the manner in which you would try to put it across. So if the society is looking at these people as animals, these people, because remember, right after partition, they came and prospered like anything. They rose to the highest kind of offices. They were close confidants of the Pakistani regime, of the Pakistani kind of elite and the people who are driving the regime. So they see that their life in Bangladesh as a huge calm down. There's a huge come down from the aristocrats that they had managed to become right after the partition. Okay, that's a provisional response to your question. I'll think more about the journey. I haven't really given much thought about to that. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry. Praveen had a question. He was raising his hand. Quickly, Praveen. Yeah.
Rajarshi, I think there are two cells that came out in the presentation. One, in the presentation that you made, you are arguing that the self is claiming to be nothing, in which the sovereign over the self is somebody else, let's say the nation state, which is determined. So therefore, the idea of nothing or nothingness is coming in the self. First point. In your response to Ram, you made an important point. Which is actually the central of your today's presentation. That is the refusal to die. So when the self is the refusal to die, when the self is arguing or thinking or making an attempt in restricting or refusing to die, the self is reasserting the sovereign over the self. So here, one, what happens to a nation state? One. Second, the self is also.
I didn't get how it connects to what happens to the nation state.
Yeah. I'll explain this. So here the self is trying to be a self only in terms of paper, the camouflage idea. Let's say a citizen in terms of paper citizen.
Not entirely, because they're also having to enact that citizen, perform that citizen.
Okay. So, because most nation states are accepting people as citizens only in terms of paper. So, this is second. Third is Bangladesh was for a very long time associated with Pakistan, and now this comes to my last point. That is Faisal Riji, his book Muslims on Pakistan and the Political Idea. Now, in that, he is proposing that it is not the Holy Land, but it is anybody can be a citizen, provided you do not really claim to have any ethnicity or any linkage to the land and soil, but you feel a sense of belonging to the nation state. And here he is also arguing something that is that is in the large nation state debate, Pakistan really didn't cater to what the idea of nation state, and also it is also unsettling for the fact that people were forced to settle in a place. So now, having said all of this, how do we see the very political statement of political idea of Bangladesh?
I can't go into this because this is a completely different issue altogether. I'm not dealing with the history of the emergence of Bangladesh or with debates about the debates in terms of the principles involved in the kind of nationalism one associates with Pakistan. That's a little outside the scope of this paper. Okay, but let me just respond and clarify to your first issue that you raised. The self is not cancelling out. Nobody is saying, when one is saying I am nothing, that's not the self. That's not the self. That is a self which is saying that I count for nothing for people like you. That is also a moment of assertion, which is speaking with a different tongue, which is speaking from a different kind of vantage point. Okay, but you are going to, ironically, you are going to acknowledge me as a self only when I put on my camouflage. That's the irony of the situation. The problem is that, so when you are recognizing me in my camouflage as a self, I am having to undergo a kind of surgery on my deeper self in order to count as a self in your eyes. Okay? That's the kind of direction I was trying to take. Okay, thank you so much. Your patient lot.
On behalf of the JNU academic team, I would like to thank Dr. Dasgupta for a wonderful paper and a wonderful presentation. And I would also like to thank Dr. Mohinder Singh for his views, comments, and questions. And also thank you to the audience for attentiveness and their engagement. With that, this session has come to an end.